Iraq sits on the fifth largest oil reserves on Earth. 90% of its government revenue comes from crude. Yet 2 decades after the invasion in 2003, the country still hasn't recovered. Not because it lacked wealth or elections or a constitution, but because what was destroyed went far deeper than a single regime. And the destruction did not begin in 2003. Years before foreign tanks rolled into Baghdad, Iraq's state machinery was already running on fumes. The Iran-Iraq War, stretching from 1980 to 1988, drained nearly a third of the country's GDP and left hundreds of thousands dead or wounded. The war's end brought no relief. In 1990, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait triggered a swift international response. The Gulf War that followed destroyed about 70% of Iraq's power grid and left vital infrastructure in ruins. By the early 1990s, industrial output had shrunk by a third, and public sector jobs vanished by the tens of thousands. Sanctions imposed by the United Nations in 1991 cut oil revenues from $30 billion to just $5 billion a year. Imports of medicine, spare parts, and even school supplies slowed to a trickle. The World Bank reported that Iraq's per capita GDP fell from $2,800 in 1989 to just $1,200 by 2002. The urban middle class, once the backbone of the bureaucracy, shrank to less than 10% of the population. Unemployment in Baghdad's formal sector soared from 6% to over 20%. Electricity, once a given, was available only a few hours a day. Hospitals ran at a fraction of their former capacity, and schools struggled to function without teachers or materials. Inside the ministries, the effects were visible in every corridor. Staff numbers dwindled as salaries evaporated. Equipment grew obsolete. The best-trained engineers and doctors left for jobs in the Gulf. By 2003, the Iraqi state was a shell. Ministries clung to life on minimal budgets. The army looked strong on paper but was hollowed out by low morale and poor supply. And the bureaucracy, once a source of national pride, was brittle and under-resourced. Any attempt to rebuild after war would have to start from this point. A government stripped of capacity, held together by patronage and fear, and already weakened by decades of conflict and isolation. On March 20, 2003, coalition forces crossed into Iraq. Within 3 weeks, Baghdad fell and Saddam Hussein's regime collapsed. But the end of one order did not bring the arrival of another. As the world watched, the main justification for the invasion, claims that Iraq held active stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction, began to unravel. The Iraq Survey Group, tasked with finding those weapons, reported in 2004 that no such stockpiles existed. The legal and political foundation for the war evaporated almost as quickly as the regime itself. On the ground, the collapse of authority was immediate and total. Ministries stood abandoned. Looters stripped the Ministry of Oil, the Ministry of Health, and the National Museum of Everything from computers to ancient artifacts. In the first weeks after the invasion, the Ministry of Education lost nearly all of its equipment, and the Ministry of Finance was emptied of records and cash. Military units, stretched thin and unprepared for policing, could not stop the chaos. By May, government offices across Baghdad were gutted. According to CPA records, over 90% of ministry buildings were either looted or occupied by squatters and armed groups. The police force, once 300,000 strong, was reduced to a few thousand officers without weapons or clear authority. This vacuum was not just physical, it was institutional. The state's capacity to deliver electricity, water, and basic services collapsed. Hospitals ran on generators, water treatment plants stood idle, and garbage piled up in the streets. The sudden absence of governance left millions of Iraqis uncertain about who, if anyone, was in charge. The looting of ministries was more than a symptom of disorder. It was a signal that the old state had vanished overnight, leaving nothing to fill the gap. This is the context in which the Coalition Provisional Authority would soon make its most consequential decisions. Paul Bremer arrived in Baghdad in May 2003 as head of the Coalition Provisional Authority. Within days, he issued 2 orders that would reshape Iraq's future. The first, known as Order Number 1, banned all senior Ba'ath Party members from public employment. This was not a symbolic gesture. About 500,000 civil servants, including engineers, teachers, doctors, and technocrats, lost their jobs almost overnight. In ministries already gutted by years of war and sanctions, the loss of this expertise brought daily operations to a standstill. Hospitals lost senior physicians, power stations lost their lead engineers, and school systems lost experienced administrators. A week later, Order Number 2 dissolved the entire Iraqi military and security forces. 400,000 soldiers, along with 150,000 reservists, were dismissed without pay or plan for reintegration. The country's only organized security apparatus disappeared in an instant. In the absence of police or army, looting continued unchecked and armed groups began to fill the vacuum. These decisions left ministries paralyzed and the streets unguarded. The immediate effect was a deepening sense of chaos. Hundreds of thousands of men, many with weapons and military training, found themselves unemployed and angry. For many, joining insurgent groups or local militias became the only option. The removal of both the bureaucracy and the army did more than dismantle Saddam's regime. It shattered the last pillars holding the state together, setting the stage for the violent power struggles that followed. Car bombs and suicide attacks began to tear through Baghdad, Mosul, and Bakuba as early as 2004. Insurgent groups, many led by former soldiers and Baathists, targeted police stations, markets, and government offices. By 2006, the United Nations was reporting more than 100 civilian deaths each month from urban bombings alone. The violence was not random. It mapped onto the deepening sectarian rift that followed the introduction of Iraq's new political order. In 2005, the Iraqi constitution established a power-sharing system known as muhassasa, dividing ministries and top government posts along sectarian and ethnic lines. The presidency went to a Kurd, the prime minister to a Shia, and the speaker of parliament to a Sunni. Ministries like Interior and Defense were parceled out in proportions: 51% Shia, 28% Sunni, 21% Kurdish, locking political identity to communal quotas. Instead of resolving distrust, the system hardened it. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a Jordanian militant, seized on the chaos. His group, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, launched a campaign of mass casualty bombings aimed at igniting civil war between Sunnis and Shia. Between 2004 and 2007, attacks on mosques, shrines, and neighborhoods deepened the spiral. Each bombing fueled reprisals and pushed ministries further under the control of sectarian parties and their armed wings. The attempt to build a new state through quotas and elections instead entrenched a politics of fear and exclusion, leaving governance fragmented and security ministries vulnerable to infiltration by militias. The violence of these years set the mold for Iraq's fractured post-war order. In June 2014, the city of Mosul fell in less than a week. An estimated 1,500 ISIS fighters swept across northern Iraq, overrunning Iraqi army divisions that had once numbered over 12,000. Within days, police and soldiers abandoned their posts, leaving behind weapons, vehicles, and entire bases. Over 500,000 civilians fled, and the Iraqi government declared a state of emergency as the scale of the collapse became clear. Behind the headlines, a deeper contest was underway. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps moved quickly, dispatching weapons, cash, and military advisors to Baghdad and the southern provinces. Within 48 hours of Mosul's fall, IRGC officers were coordinating with Shia militias and Iraqi officials, supplying arms and organizing defensive lines around the capital. Emergency funds, estimated at $200 million, flowed to the Ministry of Defense and the newly forming Popular Mobilization Forces. IRGC training camps in Iran and Syria opened their doors to thousands of Iraqi volunteers. The Mosul disaster exposed how years of institutional decay left Iraq unable to defend its own territory. It also revealed how regional powers could shape the country's fate almost overnight. As ISIS seized oil fields and border crossings, the Iraqi state lost control not just of land, but of its monopoly on violence. The rapid expansion of foreign-backed militias and the collapse of regular forces set the stage for a new era, one where the lines between state and non-state actors would blur, and where external patronage would become a permanent feature of Iraq's security landscape. After 2014, Iraq's security map was redrawn by the formal integration of militias into the state. The Popular Mobilization Forces, known as the PMF, became legal under Law 71, granting their commanders state salaries, pensions, and seats in parliament. Figures like Muqtada al-Sadr, once leading street protests and commanding the Mahdi army, now shaped cabinet decisions and budget allocations. Oil revenue, which accounts for over 90% of Iraq's government income, became the lifeblood not only for ministries but for these armed networks. Each year, the federal budget set aside billions for PMF payrolls and procurement, often without clear oversight. Contracts for reconstruction, security, and even oilfield services increasingly flowed through militia-linked firms. This system, where armed groups control access to state resources, turned the budget process into a competition for patronage. The same oil wealth that could have rebuilt Iraq instead deepened corruption, shifting the survival of ministries and political parties to the fortunes of militia leaders. For ordinary Iraqis, the lines between government, business, and armed groups blurred, fueling anger at a system seen as both unaccountable and unchangeable. September 2017 brought a defining moment for Iraq's Kurds. At polling stations across the region, more than 92% voted for independence, an overwhelming show of frustration with Baghdad's rule. Masoud Barzani called it a mandate, but the central government answered with border closures, frozen oil revenues, and troops in Kirkuk. The economic blockade that followed slashed salaries and deepened mistrust, leaving Kurdish autonomy more fragile than ever. 2 years later, a new crisis erupted. In October 2019, tens of thousands, mostly young Iraqis, filled city streets, demanding jobs and an end to corruption. Security forces fired live rounds, and by November 2019, over 500 protesters were dead. The resignation of the Prime Minister marked a rare concession, but the movement's core demand for real accountability went unanswered, exposing Iraq's unresolved divides. Today, Iraq still struggles to rebuild real sovereignty amid fractured institutions and persistent foreign influence. Elections and oil wealth alone cannot repair a hollowed state. As instability endures, Iraq's future hinges not on resources, but on rebuilding trust, governance, and unity, challenges that define the region's stakes now. Share your thoughts below.